At dawn on a frost-muted Georgia back road, a county worker noticed tire tracks ending where they should not, leading to a shallow ditch holding a stillness colder than December air, a purse rimed with ice, paperwork fluttering, and the immediate certainty that time itself had paused to preserve evidence. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The woman was identified within hours, not because of drama or luck, but because rural counties keep careful records and neighbors still read the local paper. Her name was Emily Rebecca Harlan, 22 years old, home from college for the holidays, last seen driving her aging sedan from her parents' house toward a friend's apartment in the county seat. The discovery came on December 27, 1991, 2 days after Christmas, when decorations still hung from porches and the radio still played carols between farm reports. The responding deputies documented the scene with deliberate restraint, photographing the tire impressions, the purse contents, the frost patterns that told them the body had been there overnight, not longer. Emily's winter coat was zipped, her shoes intact, her posture suggesting placement rather than collapse. No weapon was visible. The absence of chaos was itself a detail. Emily Harlan had grown up on a red clay road lined with pecan trees, attended the same Baptist church her grandparents had, and worked part-time at a bookstore when she was home. Her plans were ordinary and therefore, to those who loved her, invaluable. She was studying education, hopping to teach elementary school. Thanksgiving had been spent arguing gently about politics around the table, her father already gray at the temples, her mother saving newspaper clippings. Christmas Eve had been quiet. Emily had wrapped gifts with the television on low, laughing at a rerun, promising to call friends after the holiday. Her disappearance was first noticed when she did not return home that night and did not answer the phone Christmas morning. In 1991, there were no cell phones to ping, no social media timelines to review, only a sedan that did not arrive and a daughter who did not call. The initial investigation followed the manual that had guided deputies for decades. A missing person report was filed. Flyers were printed and taped to grocery store windows. A canvass began along the route Emily would have taken, a 2-lane road bordered by fields and a creek that flooded in spring. Witnesses recalled seeing her car at a convenience store near dusk. The clerk remembered her because she paid with exact change and joked about the cold. A farmer reported headlights idling on the shoulder later that night, but memory after Christmas is imprecise, layered with meals and visits. The medical examiner conducted a preliminary assessment at the scene, noting no obvious trauma and estimating time of death consistent with exposure to cold overnight. Autopsy would follow, methodical and quiet, the way rural offices handled loss without spectacle. The autopsy revealed subtle findings that shaped the case for years. There were signs of restraint without injury, pressure points that suggested compliance rather than struggle. Toxicology was negative. There was no indication of sexual assault. Cause of death was determined as asphyxia, with no fractures, no defensive wounds, a conclusion that troubled investigators because it left so few traces to chase. The lack of injury narrowed the field and widened it at the same time. Whoever was responsible knew Emily, or at least knew how to keep her calm. By New Year's Day, local press coverage had settled into a sober rhythm. The county weekly ran a black and white photo of Emily taken at her high school graduation. Headlines avoided speculation. Editors understood their readers were neighbors. Tips came in steadily. Deputies logged each one by hand, cross-referencing addresses, nodding alibis offered without being asked. In a town where everyone knows each other, silence is as loud as accusation. Attention focused early on the car. Emily's sedan was found a mile from the ditch, parked behind a closed warehouse, keys missing. Tire impressions matched those at the scene. Inside, there was no sign of forced entry. The radio was off. A receipt from the convenience store sat on the passenger seat, time-stamped just before dusk. Investigators dusted for prints, lifting partials that matched Emily and an unknown set, too smudged to identify in 1991. The evidence was boxed, labeled, and placed in a cold archive room where files slept under fluorescent light. As winter gave way to a mild Georgia spring, the case slowed. Leads thinned. A man questioned twice passed a polygraph and was released. Another left town. Rumors circulated and faded. Emily's parents marked birthdays and holidays with an empty chair. Thanksgiving came again, then Christmas, the season that had taken her now returning with cruel regularity. The case remained open, a folder on a shelf, a name spoken carefully. In the late 1990s, advances in forensic science prompted a review. The unknown prints were re-examined, still insufficient. Fibers from Emily's coat were tested, inconclusive. The county joined a regional task force to revisit unsolved cases, sharing methods if not always resources. The Harlan file was thick but tidy, a testament to deputies who had done everything they could with what they had. The turning point came quietly in 2008, when the state crime lab offered to reprocess evidence using newer techniques. Among the items was a strip of adhesive used to collect fibers from the sedan's door frame. It held skin cells too small to matter in 1991, now enough to build a partial DNA profile. The profile was uploaded to a state database, not with expectation but with patience. Months passed. Then a hit came back to a man arrested years later for an unrelated assault in a neighboring county. His name was Thomas Ray Caldwell, then in his early 40s, a former delivery driver who had worked seasonal routes in 1991, including the warehouse area where Emily's car was found. Investigators reopened the case with care. Caldwell's employment records placed him near the route Emily took. His prior arrest showed a pattern of coercion without overt violence, eerily consistent with the autopsy findings. Witness interviews were conducted again, this time recorded digitally. A former coworker recalled Caldwell mentioning a broken-down car one cold night before New Year's, a detail dismissed at the time. The convenience store clerk, older now, recognized Caldwell from a photo lineup as a regular who lingered. A warrant was obtained to collect Caldwell's DNA. The match was confirmed, linking him to the sedan. Further searches uncovered a receipt from the same convenience store in his old records, time-stamped within minutes of Emily. Phone records placed him in the area, his pager logs showing activity along the route. The evidence was circumstantial but converging, each piece lawful, each step documented. When Caldwell was arrested in 2019, the community reacted not with shock but with a heavy nod. He had lived quietly, attended ball games, waved from his porch. In court, the prosecution laid out the timeline with restraint, emphasizing process over passion. The defense challenged the age of the evidence, the gaps, the years. The jury listened. The verdict came in late November, days before Thanksgiving. Guilty. Sentencing followed in December, a term that ensured Caldwell would never be free again. Emily Harlan's parents attended, older now, their grief weathered but present. Outside, Christmas lights blinked on as they had in 1991. In the aftermath, the county reviewed its cold cases again, encouraged by the resolution. Emily's name was removed from the unsolved list, not forgotten but placed with care. The road where she was found remains a road, the ditch a ditch, December still cold. Time had paused once, long enough for evidence to hold, and then, finally, it moved. The months after the initial burial passed with a disciplined quiet that defined the county's approach to unresolved loss. Emily Harlan's name did not fade from records or conversation, but it was handled with restraint, appearing in meeting minutes, in the margins of patrol logs, in the careful language of deputies who understood that endurance, not intensity, was the measure of professionalism. By February of 1992, the physical evidence had been catalogued, sealed, and stored. The cold room held boxes marked in block letters, each item logged with time, date, and chain of custody. The way small jurisdictions preserved certainty when resources were limited. The road where Emily was found was driven repeatedly, not because new answers were expected, but because routine kept memory active. Investigators reconstructed her final day using receipts, handwritten notes, and the slow process of witness recollection. Emily had left her parents' house shortly before dusk, intending to stop briefly at the convenience store and then drive toward town. The route was familiar, a straight stretch broken by a bend near the creek and a cluster of warehouses that served agricultural suppliers. In winter, traffic was light. The weather that night had dropped suddenly, a hard cold that kept people indoors and made engines reluctant. Any vehicle stopped on the shoulder would have stood out, its hazard lights visible for miles. That fact lingered in the minds of deputies, shaping their theory that Emily had not been ambushed but interrupted. The sedan's location behind the warehouse raised early questions about knowledge of the area. It was not a spot a passerby would choose at random. Employees parked there during deliveries, and drivers familiar with the routes knew the access points. Investigators compiled a list of workers with reason to be near that lot in December 1991, cross-referencing schedules, addresses, and known associates. The list was long, the interviews repetitive, the conclusions unsatisfying. Most men had families, routines, alibis that placed them at home during the hours that mattered. Others had moved away, their whereabouts uncertain. Media coverage during the first anniversary was respectful but persistent. The local paper published a timeline, reminding readers of what was known and what was not. There was no sensational language, only a request for information and a photograph of Emily smiling in a borrowed sweater. The sheriff gave a brief statement emphasizing that the case remained open and that every tip was reviewed. Calls followed, some sincere, others born of rumor. Each was logged, each evaluated, none decisive. The autopsy report continued to guide investigators in subtle ways. The absence of injury suggested control without panic. There were faint impressions on Emily's wrists consistent with restraint, but no abrasions, no bruising. The medical examiner's notes emphasized the likelihood of familiarity or perceived authority, someone Emily would not resist immediately. That narrowed attention toward individuals who interacted with the public in ways that conferred trust: delivery drivers, maintenance workers, men accustomed to offering assistance on the road. As years passed, the case became a fixture in training sessions, used to teach younger deputies the importance of thorough documentation. The original investigators retired, but their notes remained, legible and precise. In 1998, the county transitioned to computerized records, and the Harlan file was among the first to be digitized, each page scanned, each photograph preserved. This act did not bring resolution, but it ensured continuity, allowing new eyes to study old facts without distortion. Emily's parents participated in these efforts without spectacle. They attended meetings when invited, answered questions that had been asked before, and declined invitations to turn their loss into advocacy. Their focus was personal, not political. Holidays were marked privately. Thanksgiving dinners included an empty place setting once, then not again, a decision made quietly. Christmas lights went up later each year. The broader context of the early 2000s brought renewed attention to cold cases nationwide. Advances in forensic science promised answers long deferred, and state agencies encouraged local departments to submit preserved evidence for review. In Georgia, funding allowed for periodic audits of unsolved homicides, prioritizing cases with intact physical evidence. Emily Harlan's file met the criteria. When the request came in 2008 to send select items to the state lab, the decision was immediate. The evidence chosen was unremarkable by appearance: adhesive strips, fabric fibers, a steering wheel cover. In 1991, these items had offered little. By 2008, they represented potential. Technicians worked methodically, extracting what they could without destroying what remained. The resulting DNA profile was partial, not enough to name a suspect, but sufficient to enter into a database designed to grow with time. The entry was made without expectation, another quiet step in a long process. Months later, the notification arrived not with urgency but with formality. A partial match had been identified, requiring confirmation. The name attached to the match was Thomas Ray Caldwell, arrested in 2005 for an assault charge that ended in a plea. Caldwell's record showed transient employment, seasonal work that placed him across county lines, and a pattern of minor offenses that suggested instability rather than escalation. He had lived within 30 miles of Emily's route in 1991. Investigators reopened interviews with care, aware that memory degrades and suggestion contaminates. They relied on documentation rather than recollection where possible. Employment records confirmed Caldwell's presence in the warehouse district during December 1991. Fuel receipts placed his vehicle on the same road within the relevant window. None of this proved guilt, but it established opportunity. Further analysis of the sedan yielded renewed findings. A partial palm print, once too degraded, now showed enough ridge detail to compare. The comparison did not exclude Caldwell. Fiber analysis suggested contact with a jacket similar to one listed among his possessions during the 1990s, a common brand but consistent. Investigators resisted confirmation bias, seeking exclusion as diligently as connection. They found none. The decision to seek a DNA sample was weighed against legal standards that had evolved since 1991. A warrant was obtained based on the cumulative evidence, carefully articulated to withstand scrutiny. The collection was conducted without incident. The lab results confirmed the match, tying Caldwell to the sedan beyond reasonable doubt. From that point, the investigation accelerated, not in pace but in focus. Witnesses were recontacted, their statements compared against records. A former coworker's recollection of a late-night call gained significance when matched to pager logs. A traffic citation placed Caldwell near the creek weeks earlier, establishing familiarity. Each piece aligned without forcing. The arrest in 2019 was executed quietly. There were no cameras, no public spectacle. Caldwell was taken into custody at his residence, informed of the charge and transported. The community learned through the evening news, the anchor's tone measured. As the case moved toward trial, the narrative remained procedural. Prosecutors emphasized evidence over emotion. Defense motions challenged the age of the case, the reliability of memory, the fairness of delayed justice. The court ruled on each, guided by precedent. When the verdict was returned, it closed a chapter written slowly over decades. The sentence imposed reflected the severity of the crime and the passage of time, acknowledging both harm and endurance. In the quiet that followed, Emily Harlan's case was discussed once more in the local paper, then archived as resolved. The road remained, winter returned, and the county continued its work, carrying forward the lesson that patience, applied consistently, could outlast even the longest silence. As the case advanced toward trial, the weight of elapsed time became a subject not of sentiment but of procedure. Prosecutors prepared to explain to a jury why a crime committed in 1990 one could be adjudicated nearly 3 decades later without compromising fairness. They relied on documentation, not recollection, emphasizing that the investigation had never closed, only waited. Every transfer of evidence was traced, every seal intact, every laboratory method explained in language intended for clarity rather than persuasion. The narrative was constructed to reflect continuity, not resurrection. Pretrial hearings focused on admissibility. The defense argued that degraded samples risked contamination and that partial DNA profiles invited misinterpretation. The state responded with expert testimony describing the protocols used, the safeguards against error, and the statistical strength of the match when combined with corroborating evidence. The judge ruled narrowly, allowing the evidence while limiting speculation. The courtroom, an aging brick building with worn wooden benches, filled quietly on those days. Observers noted the absence of spectacle. Emily Harlan's life was presented through records rather than reminiscence. School transcripts established her presence in the county that winter. Employment records from the bookstore confirmed her schedule. Her parents' statements were entered by affidavit, factual, and restrained. The prosecution avoided photographs beyond identification, mindful that the jury's task was evaluation, not empathy. The defense strategy centered on doubt rooted in time. They highlighted the absence of eyewitnesses to the crime itself, the lack of a confession, the ordinary nature of the locations involved. They questioned whether Caldwell's presence in the area proved anything more than coincidence. In response, the state assembled a timeline that reduced coincidence to improbability. Each point alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a pattern. The warehouse district, once peripheral, became central. Maps were introduced, showing access roads and sightlines. Testimony established that Caldwell's delivery routes regularly passed through the area, that he had reason to know where a car could be hidden without immediate notice. Weather reports from December 1991 were entered, demonstrating the sudden cold that would have discouraged extended exposure and increased reliance on assistance. The theory presented was not dramatic. It was incremental. Expert witnesses explained the autopsy findings in neutral terms. The medical examiner described asphyxia without visible injury, the significance of restraint marks without abrasion, the absence of defensive wounds. The explanation suggested control, not chaos. The jury listened to a description of how compliance can occur without struggle when authority or familiarity is perceived. No conclusions were drawn beyond what the findings supported. The DNA evidence was contextualized carefully. The state's analyst explained partial profiles, the probability ratios, the exclusion of other known contributors. The defense cross-examined vigorously, probing margins of error. The analyst responded with specificity, returning repeatedly to protocol. The judge intervened only to maintain focus. Witnesses from the earlier investigation appeared older, their voices steady. A former coworker described Caldwell's habits without embellishment. The convenience store clerk confirmed routine interactions. None claimed certainty beyond their statements. The restraint in their testimony lent it weight. As the trial progressed, the jury took notes, requested clarifications, and examined exhibits with deliberation. There were no visible reactions when dates were mentioned, no audible responses when evidence aligned. The process unfolded at the pace of instruction. Closing arguments reflected the tone set throughout. The prosecution summarized the evidence as a convergence rather than a revelation. The defense reiterated the dangers of inference across decades. The judge instructed the jury on the standard of proof, emphasizing that time alone neither proved nor disproved guilt. Deliberations lasted 2 days. When the verdict was returned, the courtroom remained quiet, guilty on the count of murder. The finding was read without emphasis. Emily Harlan's parents sat together, hands folded. Caldwell showed little reaction. Sentencing was scheduled weeks later, allowing for presentence reports and victim impact statements. When the court reconvened in December, the season was again present in subtle ways: wreaths on doors, muted colors in the hallway. The prosecution recommended life imprisonment, citing the calculated nature of the crime and the absence of remorse. The defense requested leniency based on age and time served since the offense. The judge's ruling balanced these considerations. The sentence imposed ensured Caldwell would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life, acknowledging both the gravity of the crime and the long arc of accountability. The language of the decision emphasized lawfulness and closure rather than retribution. In the days that followed, the county addressed the outcome with restraint. The local paper reported the sentence on the 3rd page, alongside holiday events. Editorials focused on the effectiveness of evidence preservation. There were no calls for celebration. The prevailing mood was solemn acknowledgement. Emily Harlan's case prompted a review of other unsolved files. Deputies inventoried evidence, confirmed storage conditions, and prioritized submissions for testing. Training materials were updated to reflect the case's lessons. The emphasis remained procedural. For Emily's parents, the resolution altered routine without erasing loss. They visited the courthouse once more to retrieve personal effects released by order of the court. The items were ordinary: a purse, keys, papers yellowed with age. They returned home, where winter light filtered through familiar windows. The road where Emily was found remained unchanged, a stretch of asphalt bordered by fields that turned brown each winter. Drivers passed without noticing anything unusual. The ditch held no marker. The county chose not to memorialize the site, respecting the family's wishes. As another year ended, the case receded from headlines but not from record. It entered the category of solved, a designation that reflected process completed rather than pain resolved. The archive room retained its boxes, now labeled with outcomes. The investigation's conclusion demonstrated that patience and methodical work could yield results long deferred. It reinforced a principle valued by those who had served through decades of change, that justice pursued without haste could still arrive. The season returned, as it always did, carrying both memory and the quiet assurance that the work, once done, had been done properly. After sentencing, the legal process continued along predictable, restrained lines. Caldwell's defense filed a notice of appeal, a procedural step expected in cases of this gravity, particularly those resting in part on forensic advances unavailable at the time of the crime. The appeal argued that evolving DNA standards risked retroactive injustice, and that cumulative circumstantial evidence could not substitute for direct observation. The state responded with detailed briefs citing precedent, emphasizing that admissibility hinged on reliability at the time of trial, not at the time of offense. The appellate court reviewed the record methodically, focusing on whether the trial court had abused discretion. It found none. The conviction was upheld without oral argument, the opinion released quietly in early spring. With appellate review complete, the case entered its final administrative phase. Evidence was recatalogued one last time, noting disposition orders. Items with no further legal value were returned to the family or destroyed according to statute. The sedan, long stored under tarp and dust, was cleared for disposal. Its removal from impound marked a symbolic endpoint, an artifact of unresolved questions finally released. Deputies who had worked the case over the years signed the final page of the file, a customary gesture acknowledging collective effort rather than individual achievement. The sheriff's office held a brief internal review, not celebratory, focused on lessons learned. Procedures for long-term evidence storage were updated, emphasizing environmental controls and digital redundancy. Training modules incorporated the case as an example of continuity across generations of investigators. The emphasis was on patience, documentation, and respect for process. Younger deputies listened to veterans describe working with paper maps and handwritten logs, understanding that the fundamentals had not changed even as tools had. In the community, the resolution settled into routine conversation. At the grocery store and post office, people spoke of it in the past tense, with the careful phrasing reserved for shared sorrow. Some expressed surprise at the identity of the offender, others admitted they were not. The prevailing sentiment was not anger but reflection, an acknowledgement that harm could exist quietly alongside ordinary life. Churches mentioned Emily's name once more in prayers, then returned to weekly concerns. The local newspaper ran a year-end summary noting the case among other civic milestones. It described the conviction factually, without embellishment, and highlighted the role of evidence preservation. Letters to the editor were sparse, mostly thanking law enforcement for persistence. There were no calls for policy change, no public demonstrations. The town absorbed the outcome as it absorbed most things, gradually. Emily Harlan's parents adjusted to a new kind of absence. The long uncertainty that had framed their days receded, replaced by a quieter grief unburdened by unanswered questions. They donated some of Emily's belongings to a local charity, keeping others in a cedar chest. Holidays remained difficult but less sharp. Christmas lights returned to their porch, modest and white. Thanksgiving dinners continued, conversations expanding beyond the past. The courthouse file bearing Emily's name was moved from the active shelf to the resolved archive. It joined other cases, each representing a closed chapter rather than a finished story. Researchers and trainees would review it in years to come, studying how small details preserved without expectation could later converge. The cold archive room remained, fluorescent lights humming, boxes aligned, the quiet infrastructure of accountability. Caldwell began serving his sentence in a state facility, his appeals exhausted. Records reflected his transfer, his classification, his age. He became another entry in the system, defined by offense rather than biography. There were no interviews, no statements. His silence contrasted with the extensive documentation that now defined the case. As time passed, the investigation influenced how the county approached missing person reports. Emphasis was placed on early documentation, even when evidence seemed thin. Deputies were reminded that the absence of drama did not indicate the absence of significance. The case underscored that routine actions taken seriously could matter decades later. The road where Emily was found remained unmarked, a decision reached after consultation with the family. They preferred memory without monument, believing that resolution did not require physical acknowledgement. Drivers continued to pass, unaware of the history beneath their tires. Seasons cycled, frost returning each December, fields changing color, the landscape indifferent yet familiar. In broader terms, the case contributed to statewide statistics showing an increase in cold case resolutions tied to forensic re-examination. Conferences cited it briefly, emphasizing interagency cooperation. It did not become a landmark case, and that was appropriate. Its significance lay in its ordinariness, a demonstration that justice could proceed without spectacle. For those who had known Emily, memories remained grounded in everyday moments rather than the circumstances of her death. Friends recalled study sessions, laughter, plans unfulfilled. The resolution allowed these recollections to exist without intrusion. The finality of the case did not erase its history. It remained a reference point, a reminder of loss endured and effort sustained. The county's records reflected closure, but the narrative persisted in quiet ways, informing how work was done, how time was respected. As another December arrived, decorations appeared along Main Street. The radio played familiar songs. People prepared for holidays, mindful that time moved forward even when memory lingered. Emily Harlan's name appeared once more in a training manual, then settled back into the archive. The case stood complete, not triumphant, but finished according to law, its resolution measured and real, a testament to patience applied over years rather than moments. The closing phase of the Emily Harlan case settled into the slow rhythm familiar to those who had lived with it for decades. There were no announcements, no ceremonies, only paperwork completed and files signed. Resolution did not arrive as a moment, but as an acceptance that the long uncertainty had finally ended. The county returned to routine, its attention shifting back to roads, budgets, and ordinary calls for service. The case no longer demanded active labor, yet it continued to inform how work was approached. Investigators understood that some conclusions require years rather than hours, and that patience, once proven effective, becomes institutional memory. In the months following the final appeal ruling, the sheriff's office received occasional letters from neighboring jurisdictions asking about procedures used in the case. Responses were factual and brief, outlining evidence storage standards, review protocols, and interagency cooperation. There was no sense of ownership over success, only an understanding that the outcome resulted from cumulative effort across time. Younger deputies absorbed these lessons indirectly, through policy updates and quiet mentorship rather than formal instruction. Emily Harlan's name gradually disappeared from casual conversation, though it never vanished from memory. In the community, people referenced her less as a victim and more as a reminder of a shared past. The story lost its edges, becoming part of the town's collective history rather than a current wound. Older residents remembered where they were when the news first broke in 1991. Younger ones learned of it as an example of persistence rather than fear. Her parents continued their lives with a degree of calm that had once seemed impossible. They declined interviews and public acknowledgments, preferring privacy over recognition. Friends noticed that they spoke of Emily more freely now, recounting ordinary memories without hesitation. The resolution allowed those recollections to exist without the constant intrusion of unanswered questions. Holidays remained bittersweet, but they were no longer dominated by waiting. At the state level, the case was cited in internal reports evaluating the effectiveness of cold case funding. It supported arguments for sustained investment in forensic review and record preservation. Officials noted that the cost of long-term storage was minimal compared to the value of eventual resolution. The case was never used as a headline example, but as a data point reinforcing a broader trend toward methodical review. Thomas Ray Caldwell's incarceration progressed without incident. Annual reports recorded his status, age, and health, reducing his presence to administrative detail. There were no further statements, no attempts at public explanation. His role in the case concluded legally with sentencing, leaving no narrative beyond what the record already contained. The system absorbed him as it absorbed all offenders, with procedure rather than commentary. The physical spaces connected to the investigation changed subtly over time. The warehouse behind which Emily's car had been found was repurposed, its lot paved and marked. The convenience store renovated, replacing its signage and windows. The road remained, resurfaced and widened slightly, bearing more traffic than it had in 1991. None of these changes erased the past, but they demonstrated how places continue forward regardless of history. The archive room where the evidence had rested for years remained in use, though its contents evolved. Digital systems reduced reliance on physical storage, yet the principle of preservation endured. Emily's file occupied a shelf labeled Resolved, its contents occasionally reviewed during audits. It stood as proof that careful documentation, even when it seemed futile, could later become decisive. Community trust in local law enforcement deepened quietly. There were no polls or statements to measure it, only a steady willingness to cooperate, to provide information, to believe that effort would be sustained. The case reinforced the idea that attention does not end when headlines fade. For a population accustomed to measured expectations, this mattered more than declarations. As years passed, anniversaries came and went with less notice. The date of Emily's death was no longer marked in the paper. The family observed it privately, sometimes with a visit to the cemetery, sometimes with nothing more than reflection. Closure did not erase grief, but it softened its edges, allowing life to continue without constant interruption. The broader cultural moment continued to change, bringing new technologies and expectations. Yet the principles demonstrated by the case remained relevant. Evidence still required integrity. Timelines still demanded accuracy. Conclusions still depended on restraint. The story of Emily Harlan did not become obsolete because it rested on fundamentals rather than novelty. In conversations among retired deputies, the case was mentioned occasionally, usually in the context of patients. They spoke of it not with pride but with relief, acknowledging the many years when answers seemed unlikely. The resolution validated their adherence to procedure even when progress was invisible. It affirmed that doing work correctly mattered, even without immediate reward. For those who never knew Emily personally, the case became a quiet assurance that the system could function over long spans of time. It offered no comfort beyond that, but it did not need to. Its value lay in demonstrating that accountability could persist beyond seasons, beyond administrations, beyond expectations. As another winter approached, decorations again appeared across the county. December arrived with familiar cold mornings and early darkness. Life continued, shaped by routines that endured regardless of past tragedy. Emily Harlan's story remained complete, resolved within the bounds of law and evidence. It ended not with triumph, but with certainty, a measured conclusion reached through patience, documentation, and time.